Who opposes gender identity politics in your country?
It's really a hard atmosphere. It's really, the fingers are up all the time if you say something wrong. So most feminist groups who wish to do actual feminist work try to fly under the radar and try to do things in silence, and then try to stick up their head and do something. Other groups that were feminists are now totally adjusting to trans queer ideology and also confess to be cis women and privileged cis women, and they really undermine women's and girls' rights even if they don't understand it. They are like, there are girls and women's shelters that are now women's and trans shelters, and we are not allowed to. If a girl say, I want to have support from someone I think is a girl, she's thrown out. She can be thrown out of the girls' shelter because of she's a TERF. And we have a political party called Feminist Initiative, who before the last election stated that now it's time for women to stand back and let others gain some rights, meaning trans women, of course. And we have one, and also the socialists in Sweden are brainwashed. We have there's one organization called GENID, which is a group with parents who have parents from trans identified children, and they are trying to be a support group and for each other, and also try to have politics and inform about what actually trans treatments mean, etc., and also to build opinion. But there's actually no, as I can think of now, there's actually no feminist organization that clearly take a stand in the transgender question. But some of us, I'm part of a group, organization, the Women's Front, who is trying to respond to all the legislations, etc., out from girls' and women's perspective, very clearly try to have the strategy to go through everything and point out where this go against women's and girls' rights and safety.
So Germany and radical feminism is rarely mentioned on the same page, really. I remember when a young group of Spanish women set up a meeting group in our women's center, I just thought, of course, if we want radical feminists, we've got to import it. But we do have radical feminists, of course, opposing it. One site is the Störenfrieder site, a website, a Facebook group. It translates into Disturberesses of the Peace. And it was set up in 2013, and I've been a proud member since then, when we all met because we were just a handful of women opposing the sex industry and pro-prostitution advocacy. And that is how we started. I mean, annoying this kind of feel-good feminism, explaining to us how great the sex industry is by simply opposing that kind of story with what we knew about prostitution, and moving on and branching out into more topics. So the Störenfrieders is read quite a lot. It is the only easily accessible online site in Germany. But now, for example, we've done the translation of J.K. Rowling's essay on what's been happening, and it's very good because, of course, the language is a barrier, and if it takes us 7 pages, people who are not very good at English just won't read it because it would take them too long to understand it. And it is good for young feminists because they know that if they write an article, the Störenfrieders will put it online. Then there's Emma magazine, and I think it's the longest running existing feminist magazine in Europe, and they had a dossier on the trans issues from a critical perspective. They also interviewed Charlie Evans and highlighted detransitioners, and that must have been the first time detransitioners were mentioned even in Germany. So this helps, and they have also large readership. There's a feminist party, Die Frauen, the women, who are also critical, but they are a very small party. And some women's groups, for example, a lesbian group, Die Graugänse, Grey Geese, who make it clear that they center women in their advocacy. And within Terre des Femmes, the largest NGO, we still have ongoing discussions. There's a working group, but we don't know what will happen in the end. We're discussing it. Outside of feminism, individual psychologists, individual people from the trans community whose take is different from ours, but who are also critical, who are also ostracized by their communities. And of course, in politics, conservatives of the mainstream kind, like Angela Merkel's party, but also, of course, as in other countries, we have problems because of the AfD, which is basically a right-wing party, with a large Nazi bloc, is also against all kind of gender studies, like what you can see in Eastern Europe when Viktor Orban banned gender studies completely from universities, or when the Bulgarian Supreme Court banned the Convention Against Violence Against Women by the Council of Europe, the Istanbul Convention, simply because it contains the word gender. So we're having a huge problem here, and much education to do to make sure people understand the difference between a feminist analysis and a right-wing one. So these are the groups.
A little bit like what Inge was saying here. Sadly, the far right were the first to oppose it very openly, and I say sadly because of that, in many people's minds, any further critique, they associated that with far right. But of course, the reasons why they would oppose that are very, very different to feminists, because they anything that's that deviates from their idea of traditional values and family, very Catholic, is for them verboten. But well, on the left, though, many other voices are also speaking up against it, and increasingly so in the past 1 or 2 months. Things are really speeding up here. I'd like to mention first Amelia Valcárcel, who is one of the most prominent Spanish feminist philosophers, who last year devoted a whole seminar to this issue, making it visible for many women that were unaware of it until that moment. That was a turning point, or at least the beginning of it. This very week, she has spoken again against queer theory. She said that it's a Trojan horse in feminism, and how queer theory's agenda and the feminist one clashes because they don't have the same goals and objectives. Also, there were some other prominent feminists called Lidia Falcón. She has a feminist party which doesn't have, sadly, much influence in political life in Spain. And that political party was expelled from a left-wing coalition because of those views. And there are also women's groups now forming, opposing the idea of gender identity into law. One of the new groups is Alliance Against Women's Erasure. It's a group that has begun some actions against the drafts of new bills that included gender identity in text, and they have had some visibility on the press, which is very good. The downside, we could say, is that they are being connected or related to one of the parties in government. So some feminists are wary of their true intentions, and they could weaken their influence in general if they're not careful with that. Other initiatives also blooming, which new groups like Radical Feminist Space in Madrid or Feminists of Catalonia. So are other groups that are popping up lately, devoted to different issues around feminism from the radical point of view, and very interested in fighting gender identity politics. So we hope to be able to build bridges among all those groups to strengthen our position and gain visibility and power. So I'm finishing here. Some good news is that the debate is also happening now in social media. There was a silence some months ago, but now the debate is very visible. And women are not afraid to speak up as they were before. And also a very positive thing is that some men from the left are very openly siding with us feminists against queer theory, which is also a good sign and gives us some hope.
Speak Up for Women is the major group that's been working on this. And it's an interesting group because it's a sort of, I guess it's a grassroots, unstructured, doesn't have a constitution, doesn't have a formal legal structure, but it's also taking a very advocacy, non-partisan relationship building with people in the media and people in government. So it's kind of interesting organization. And we tried to work out how many full-time equivalent people we had working, and it's kind of, we'd have several hundred hours a week going into work that we're doing, which I think is quite considerable. There's a very interesting Marxist site called Redline, which has taken a very material reality view, as good Marxists should. And they've done some really interesting international work. Like, for example, when there was the big protest outside the Labour Party meeting at the conference last year, they interviewed Nick Rogers, who was the guy who spoke up at the conference the very next day in a very positive way. And they've covered lots of kind of international aspects and lots of really good analysis. There is a really active Facebook page called Broadsheet. So Broadsheet used to be the feminist magazine in New Zealand that has not published for a while, but it's an anonymous site, but it does some really interesting commentary and has quite a lot of engagement. There are two groups that are sort of in recess at the moment. The young women who are working on them are taking time out. One of them was Lesbian Rights Aotearoa. And that was, and also there was a project, a sort of counting, oh gosh, I've forgotten the name of Karen Inge Smith, that sort of counting dead women in New Zealand. And that's sort of not happening at the moment, but did happen for several years. There's a new group, Women's Liberation Aotearoa, which appears just to have a Twitter feed at the moment, but I know some of the women who are behind that, and I expect that there'll be interesting things out of that. And there's also a group called Wahine Toa Rising. So Wahine Toa means warrior women, and it's a group working against legalized prostitution. So New Zealand is a very progressive country. It's got legal prostitution, but of course there are numerous downsides. So they're working on the fact that there's no funding for women who want to exit, the additional violence that women face because of the expectations that men have, because they're kind of paying for this service, that whole idea of sort of legalized brutality. And the long-standing professional organization, the representative organization, for whom the leader of it got made a dame a couple of years ago, but doesn't appear to be a very active advocacy organization on behalf of the actual women themselves. And there's a couple of right-wing organizations, a thing called the New Conservative Party that put a bill to Parliament to stop transgender teaching in schools. And there's a long-standing right-of-centre, anti-gay, pro-traditional family group called Family First. And they've produced materials for schools about how parents can work with the schools to make sure that they don't have teaching about transgender ideology, and they've produced some legal opinions and stuff like that.
In Denmark, we have radical feminists organizing on Facebook, but sadly Facebook only. I think Bodil Wandt know some of us and our fighting for the cause, but else we not really have many. There are some right-wing Christians and from the right-wing party, Dansk Folkeparti, as a right-wing populist party, but not very much. I don't think that they really care about this problem. The biggest problem with the legal gender change law from 2014 was that some pastors from the Danish state church would have to marry persons who have changed gender, changed their legal gender. I mean, I don't think is the biggest problem with this law. So that's kind of, well, stupid. Then, if I must say myself, I'm trying to not only block, but also to break through the media's wall of silence about the problems. And sometimes I'm lucky, sometimes I'm not. But I have some articles in the press and some interviews. But it is very difficult because almost all journalists are very pro-trans. So if they allow you to say something, they try to frame you as this evil woman who hate trans women or something like that. But we really need some organizations to get more power here in Denmark.